everybody. This is Amy at City's Edge Quilt Shop and Sewing Center in Warsaw, Missouri, or should I say I am at my home studio and not at City's Edge today. Coffee with Amy and a demo, and today we're going to talk about border basics. So how to prep for the borders, decisions like what color, what size, how many, how to piece the borders, how to add the borders, which goes on first, the top, the bottom, the sides, all that good stuff we're going to discuss today. So I have a few quilts to look at so we can look at the borders on them. We'll discuss how to determine what size, all that good stuff. So the first thing I want to talk about, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you determine the color of your borders, the sizes of your borders. And I'll tell you, the question I get the most at the quilt shop is what color, or how do I determine the size? And then I think once you determine the size, it's how many borders do you need? And I think that determines by the size of the quilt that you need. Some people ask, do you put the top or the bottom on first or the sides? And as a long arm quilter, we see a lot of wonky borders. So that means we put in, when we're quilting, we either have to fold in or kind of stretch or kind of ease in the quilting for the borders because they're full. The borders are fuller than the center of the quilt. Or maybe it's opposite, and that sometimes will put a wave in the border also. The center is smaller or larger than, and you pull the borders in. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and what you can do to make sure that your quilt is as square and flat as possible. Well, the first thing I say is you have your quilts. So this is a basic border. I have my quilt center and I have my borders. And these are what I call straight piece borders. And we'll talk about that also, as I don't do a lot of bias piecing for borders, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of that. And this particular one, though, is a quilt I made for my cousin, and it just has basic borders, you can see. So one of the things I would say, the very first thing you need to do is take your quilt center, which is your pieced pretty that you put together, and give it a nice press. Get the seams down, get it as flat as possible. Make sure there's no wrinkles, crinkles, or folds in there. So when you go to measure it, you will have good measuring units. The first thing I want to do when I have my quilt center is determine, well, what size do I want to have my quilt? So let's say this quilt started off 44 by 55. And I really want it to be my overall quilt. After my borders are added, I want it to be, no, let's say 65 by 75. So I'm starting with 45 by 55. That means I'm adding 20 inches overall to my quilt. That means 10 inches on one side, or 10 inches all around, let's say. So I now know I have to add 10 inches of border. So that's the first thing we need to determine. What size do we want to get to? So a 10-inch border on a 45 by 55 quilt, that's a lot of border for if I were just going to put on one 10-inch piece of fabric. That's a lot of border. I think I would take 10 inches and I would put it into multiple borders at that point. And what I would do is kind of look at what's the rule of thumb. That's the question we always get. Well, how big do I make my borders? So the rule of thumb is usually what size is your quilt block? And you start with that. And your overall border should be anywhere between a 1/2 to 2/3 of the size of your quilt block. And then determining the size of your borders is usually determined by increments of your quilt block. So if this is a 12-inch finished block, my borders that I could use would be 1.5, a 3, a 6, or 3, a 4, a 6, a 9, and then you have your 12. So if I want to add 10 inches, because I wanted my quilts to be 65 by 75, I have to look at how many borders I want. We already determined 10-inch of one piece of fabric is too much. So maybe I go with 1.5. Then I go with 3 and then 6. And that will give me 10.5 inches. That would give me the closest to my 10 inches. So I think on my overall quilts, that's what I would do. I would do 3 borders. So the question then becomes, all right, let's see, what colors do we want? And what, do I want a big print out here? And I could have done that. This is a very basic quilt. I could have put several, a big, busy, patriotic border on the outside edge. But this is a little more monochromatic, and I just wanted the basics of red, white, and blue. My cousin is in the military, so this is his quilt. He went overseas, so he left it with us to play with. I'm going to show you another quilt. Judy made this quilt. Okay, and here's another thing you might want to think of. So here's the basic block right here. And what Judy did was, in her sashing, she carried it to the outside. So this is your first border right here. And that is really, again, with the sashing. So she kept it the size of the sashing, but that made her block float a little bit. So versus this one, which is cut off, is what I say. I call this a stop border. It's really an inner border. I always call it a stop border because it's stopping the busyness of your quilt center, and then it goes out to your border. So your inner border, stop border. Okay, she doesn't have that. What she did, her stop border was the same as the background, and it gave her block a floating look. Then she added her borders on, and they are, again, increments of her 12-inch block. So that is one way to do it. Another way to look at it is piecing your borders. So I have 2 borders. This one is pieced. This quilt has your floating border. So it's got an inner border. Then it's got a border fabric that was used. And then it's got another separation border before it gets to the piece border. And that helped to incrementally increase the size of the borders. We showed this quilt a couple weeks ago when we were talking about sashings and cornerstones. And I wanted to show here, we have one border that separates the sashing and cornerstones. Then we have a pieced border, another border, and then 2 more. That makes this quilt a queen king size, and you can see how much bigger it is. So to enlarge the center of the quilt, we added another good 12 inches by adding another piece section to the quilt. So that's always an option, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about determining the size and how much fabric you might need for your quilts. So let's talk about measuring for your borders. Some people will measure the top. Oops, let me open that up. We'll measure the side left, right, and then the top, bottom, and then the center, and take the average of the three. So, but you would want to do that, I guess, in general, just to determine the fabric needs that you have. So if my quilt top is 44 by, or 45 by 55, then I'm going to measure 45 or 55 down, right? General width of fabric is 40 to 45 inches. So I already know I need 2 strips per side, or at least 1.5 strips per side. Now, when I determine my top and bottom borders, I have to include the side borders that I now have added. Because if I'm doing the sides first, then the top and bottom have to include those borders. So it would be the 45 plus the 20. I would also need 2, at least 1.5 to 2 for the top and bottom. So I have 2, 4, 6, 8 strips, right, that I need right now. If I were just going to add on one piece of fabric, 10 inches, I would take those 8 strips times 10. I would need 80 inches of length of fabric. And that would be, and I'd probably add an 1/8 or 1/4 just for straightening and all that good stuff, to make sure that, you know, my borders are on the straight of grain, and we're looking at that. Because we want our borders to be on straight. Let's talk about straight of grain real quick. This is really in the rotary cutting class, but it's important when you are looking at your borders. I have not pressed this, but I would press this really good because I wasn't planning this piece in our demo, and here we are. But if I put my selvages together, and let's say this was not cut straight on grain, do you see that little bit of wave that's in the hanging of the fabric? Okay, that means I am not on the straight of grain. So if you put your selvages together and that's how it's hanging, when you have your side pieces together, then you want to shift your fabric until it gets straight and hangs straight. And hopefully you can see that on the camera. That will determine that you are straighter on the grain of fabric. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about there, selvage to selvage is your width of fabric, and then off the bolt is your length of fabric, okay? We want selvage to selvage, our width of fabric, to hang nicely. And it is much harder to do on a larger piece of fabric, but it can still be done. You just hold your arms out a little bit further. It's okay that it's kind of hanging on each side, but make sure that it's hanging straight. And then when you go to cut it, you now know it's on the straight. You're going to bring it up here. And see, I'm a little off right there. I'm going to want to trim that off first. But now I know my borders are on the straight of grain. So why that's important, with the fabric, selvage to selvage, length, anything that's crooked has a slight bias in it. And bias means I'm cutting across the grains. And when you do that, you have a lot of stretch and pull in the bias. The tightest non-stretch is on the width, or the length of the fabric. There's less stretch than pulling this way. And this way is less stretch than pulling this way. So hopefully you can see that. And whenever you do the bias, you have the potential to stretch and make your borders a little bit wonky. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, I want to show you something at the sewing machine. So last week, I think it was, it might have been 2 weeks ago, we talked about sashings without cornerstones, and I used this as an example. And I have two pieced borders. Well, let's say it is a part of my quilt or it's a pieced border, and I want to add an extra outer border to that. Generally, what we had just discussed is the basics of measuring your borders. I'm just going to use this as a little piece here. If you measured your borders, let's say I took the length of my quilt, top to bottom, and measured the center. I came up with 21 inches. I'm now cutting my left and right borders 21 inches. Now, if I did not cut them 21 inches because, it's really long. We talked about easing it in, and I'll show this again about easing it in. But the other thing is, what I hear a lot is it's too hard to measure 96 inches or 108 inches after I've pieced it together. So what they tend to do, I want you to note, see how this is the same size? Okay, that means this should fit to this side pretty good. Okay, well, let's say this is 96 inches. And I'm gonna just put this on top of my sashing and sew this real quick. Okay, so one, if you do adjust as you're moving, as I just did, this is what happens. I get two off and I no longer have a good quarter inch. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is now I want to add this side, and I want you to notice this right here. They're no longer the same length. I am matching up this end and coming down, and I am a quarter inch off. Okay? And that's because the more seams you have in your quilt center, the more you have to pull and stretch your seams or whatever the case may be. Now, this is just a 21-inch strip. So imagine if this was 108 inches, how far off that would be. Okay, so that's why you want to measure the center of your quilt, and you want to take your left and right, cut them the same length, and then you would ease in the difference. Okay, and then that way, when you're done, these left and right sides are exactly the same size. You might have a little bit of bagging on the inside because this one I had to ease in, this one I had to ease out. Okay, but in the end, your quilt will be square. Okay, I have this little pad here, so I have measured my inches here. I've measured down the center. I put my left and right on. Okay, so now let's talk about, after I measured the center, put my left right on, I want to measure the center of here because I have to include the sizes of my borders. All right, so I did that. And now I'm ready to pin on my borders. Okay. Let's see. So on this end, we are pretty good. On this end, let's see. Well, we're pretty good, but I have to ease it in just about a 1/16 of an inch down here. So just like we discussed on the binding, which truly, I'm sorry, on the sashings, and truly, I would not measure every block and take the average to ensure my blocks are square, but I would cut all my sashings 12 inches and make them work, right? Ease them in, just like we're doing here. But I would do the similar process. I would find the center of my quilt, fold it in half or measure it, pin each end. And guys, you would do this for every border. We just determined that I needed 3 borders on my quilt. So I would measure for my first border, the center, and then cut my 2 1.5 inches and then add those borders. And then I would do it again because everybody's 1/4 inch is different. Okay. And to ensure that your quilt stays square, you want to measure each time you're adding something that's pieced. So I've eased that in a little bit. You can see there's a little bit of bag there. That's my 1/16 of an inch. So I'm just going to kind of spread that out, maybe put an extra pin there. Okay, so there we go. I've got to show you my cute little pincushion. Lori Pulliam made this. Isn't he super cute? It's needlepoint, cross stitch, I assume. But he is so cute, so I just had to show him. Because who doesn't love a cute pincushion? Okay, now I have my borders. Okay, let's say these are sewn on. I could put a cornerstone on here just as a direct decorative element. All right. And the reason I might like to do that is because maybe I have a border fabric or striped fabric and I'm uncomfortable with doing bias corners. Then if I was using a stripe or a border fabric, I would just use cornerstones. That way I don't have to worry about matching up border fabrics or stripes and still get that cool effect that you want with border fabrics. So that would be a time I would use cornerstones and borders for sure. All right. I have another little piece here. And I'm going to be using this one next week when we talk about waves. Next week, it's all about waves. So I have a pieced border. So I've added my 4 borders. And one thing I would want to make sure of, I showed you a couple quilts that had pieced borders. You have to ensure that this border is going to fit your pieced border. Okay, so I know how long my piece border is, that I have to ensure the width of the sides is going to match that. And then when I add this piece on, right, that it's going to work also. Now it's a little long here, but I haven't pieced the sides on yet. So those 1/4 inches will be gone. And then this will come together like that. So that's something else you have to determine when you're deciding what size your border needs to be. This little package here is Shine by Sweetwater. It's a little charm pack, Shine by Sweetwater, and we do have it in the shop. It is very sweet. So we are going to next week talk about, I will have this quilt together. And one of the things we're going to talk about is adding scallops and waves, and how cute will this be as a baby quilt with scallops and waves. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today for basics of borders, and next week we will be talking about scallops and waves, and I hope you join me. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today. Enjoy this beautiful weather. Have a great weekend, and I will see you Thursday. Talk to you Thursday. What's new in the studio? Bye-bye now.